In the sleepy little town of Millersville, Pennsylvania, a place known more for its university than anything remotely sinister, an ominous fog rolled in over the banks of the Little Susquehanna River on the evening of Friday, July 13, 1978. The misty blanket seemed almost sentient, as if it had chosen this particular day to manifest. Teenagers often ventured out to these parts, indulging in youthful escapades while basking in the town's tranquil obscurity. But this Friday, a heavier sense of dread hung in the air, so palpable it could almost be touched. On this ill-fated evening, a group of teenagers, local Millersville kids, decided to take their escapades to a new level. Driven by boredom, recklessness, and the foolish invincibility that comes with youth, they found themselves bullying a quiet, peculiar boy who had somehow caught their attention. Unlike most kids in the area, this boy didn't belong to any particular group, didn't excel in sports, didn't stand out in school. His presence was almost ghost-like, forgotten as soon as he was out of sight. Drawn by a twisted curiosity and a mean streak they themselves didn't fully understand, these kids decided to play a prank on him. Under the guise of newfound friendship, they lured the boy to the banks of the Little Susquehanna River. Laughter and taunts filled the air as they cruelly pushed the boy into the water, disregarding his frantic screams that he couldn't swim. They watched, detached, as his flailing arms finally succumbed to the water's embrace. The moon, partially hidden by thickening clouds, was the only silent witness to this dark act. Once he had sunk, the teenagers scattered, swallowed by the fog and the heavy silence that followed. Back in town, oblivious to the terrible act that had just taken place, a woman was pacing restlessly in her modest home. She felt an inexplicable ache in her heart, an instinctual dread that sent her gaze drifting toward the wooded horizon. As a single mother, she had learned to live with constant worry, but this was different, more pressing, as if the evening itself was trying to warn her. She couldn't shake off the feeling that she had just lost something irreplaceable, something infinitely precious. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for reasons she couldn't understand, she found herself gradually walking toward the door. Unbeknownst to her, the soul-crushing act committed by the teenagers had set in motion a series of events that would forever taint the idyllic peace Millersville had taken for granted. Darkness had fallen, and it was as if the fog that enveloped the Little Susquehanna carried with it an insidious whisper, a promise of horror and retribution. The teenagers returned to their homes, ignorant of the devastating chain of events their vile actions had initiated. In their youthful arrogance, they assumed they'd get away with it, as they had with so many other small cruelties before. But some acts are too evil to go unpunished, too dark for any small town to contain. In Millersville, a chilling undercurrent had been awakened, an impending doom that would manifest in terrifying ways, irrevocably changing the lives of its residents. And in the heart of a grief-stricken mother, a ferocious resolve began to take form. A merciless vendetta ignited by an agony only a parent could comprehend. Something had snapped. An age-old equilibrium had been shattered, and the town of Millersville would soon come to realize that some fates are far worse than death. The mist over the Little Susquehanna had carried away the innocence of a town, leaving behind a silence that screamed in its haunting emptiness. The story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Months turned into seasons, and the tight-knit community of Millersville went about its daily life, blissfully ignorant of the gathering storm. But the woman, whose eyes had lost their luster and whose laughter had died the day her son never returned, was not idle. She had scoured the wooded areas, spent countless hours alongside local law enforcement searching the riverbanks of the Little Susquehanna, and even knocked on every door in town, hoping against hope that someone had seen anything that could explain her son's mysterious disappearance. Officially, he was considered missing, but in her heart, she knew he was gone forever. Each passing day only intensified the churning vortex of her despair and, more alarmingly, her unquenchable thirst for retribution. She had come to know the faces of the teenagers responsible, their habitual haunts, and the intricate tapestry of their seemingly mundane lives. Local festivals, Friday night football games at Penn Manor High, the annual township fair, these became her stages of quiet observation. Unbeknownst to the merry participants, each public gathering was also a scouting mission, where she weighed and considered the instruments of her inevitable wrath. The quiet boy's absence was hardly noted. Teachers cleared his name from their rosters, attributing his disappearance to a possible out-of-state move, or perhaps a tragic, unspoken event that was best left undiscussed. In a community where everyone knew everyone else, it was unsettling how quickly someone could be erased, relegated to a fleeting memory or an uncomfortable pause in conversation. The teenagers who had tormented him suffered from fleeting nightmares, jolts of unease, but they were too caught up in their lives to dwell on past misdeeds for long. Then, as autumn leaves began to carpet the landscape in shades of orange and brown, another Friday the 13th loomed on the calendar. The year was 1979, and the atmosphere in Millersville was different this time. Halloween decorations adorned the porches of suburban homes, the excitement for the season's festivities palpable in the air, but the atmosphere was heavy, clouded by an intangible dread that settled over the community. Animals acted strangely, restless. The wind carried cryptic murmurs through the boughs of the ancient trees lining the Little Susquehanna. This Friday the 13th, the group of teenagers decided to host a bonfire in the woods near where they had committed the cruel act just over a year before. Perhaps they were drawn there by a subconscious desire for closure, or maybe just the recklessness that accompanies youth. They laughed, they drank, and they reveled in the crisp autumn night, their faces flickering in the bonfire's dance. Yet, amidst the laughter and shouts, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A set of eyes lurking just beyond the firelight's reach, piercing through the darkness, studying them. The sound of twigs breaking underfoot, the hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, ordinary sounds that now carried ominous undertones. The bonfire flickered as if disturbed by an invisible breath. The wind changed direction, carrying with it a faint, almost unrecognizable scent of rot and stagnant water. The atmosphere grew dense, suffocating. That's when they found the first token, a dilapidated doll hanging from a tree by a noose, its plastic eyes gouged out, wearing the torn remnants of what looked to be children's clothing. A scream caught in the throat of one girl, a choked gasp in another. The boys exchanged uneasy glances but dismissed it as a distasteful prank by a rival group. It was then that the sense of impending doom reached its climax, its noxious fumes intoxicating the air around them. One by one, they decided to call it a night, a stifled urgency hastening their movements. As they snuffed out the bonfire and made their way out of the woods, they couldn't shake the dread that clung to them like a second skin. They had awoken something, and as they walked away, none of them noticed the figure of a woman emerging from the veil of the trees, her eyes alight with a cold, unfathomable fury. In her hands, she held a tarnished locket containing a faded photograph of a young boy, her boy. Opening it, she whispered words that were swallowed by the woods but that sent a chill down the spine of every creature within earshot. "You will know my suffering," she intoned, her voice imbued with an ineffable darkness. The wind seemed to carry her vow into every nook and cranny of Millersville, embedding itself into the very fabric of the town. As the first rays of sunlight penetrated the mist of the Little Susquehanna River the following morning, Millersville woke up to a day like any other. Children laughed, parents prepared for another day, the elderly exchanged pleasantries at the local bakery. Yet, a sinister undercurrent had silently infiltrated the town, an unspoken understanding that their lives were on the brink of irrevocable change. And somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of a grieving mother's mind, a malevolent plan continued to take shape, a plan that would bring a terror upon Millersville the likes of which it had never seen before. Unseen, unfelt, but they're always there like a slowly tightening noose. The town remained blissfully unaware, its residents still treating each day as a gift, each mundane event as a moment to cherish. But for how much longer? As they say, some things are better left undisturbed, for when darkness is awakened, it is indiscriminate in its wrath. Millersville would soon learn the cost of harboring sins that are too monstrous to remain buried. For in those dark woods, by the banks of the little Susquehanna, something had stirred. And it was awake now, its eyes wide open, hungry for retribution. The wheel had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. In the subsequent weeks, Millersville began to feel the subtle shifts that come when a place is marked for something sinister. Small things at first, pets going missing, odd carvings found on tree trunks deep in the woods, the sense of being watched growing ever more pervasive. Nightfall, once a gateway to respite and relaxation, now became a curfew. The sun setting over the little Susquehanna River cast long shadows that seemed to stretch into the very souls of the townspeople. For the woman, whose life had collapsed into a single, burning purpose, each day was a preparation for the night. Using the cover of darkness, she visited places that carried the scent of her tormentors. She could feel their youthful arrogance, their unearned confidence, wafting in the air. The local diner where they often hung out after school, the makeshift parking lot that turned into an impromptu party spot on weekends, even their homes, where they slept without a care in the world, wrapped in the safety of their ignorance. She left behind tokens, similar to what she had left in the woods, symbols of childhood innocence, twisted into harbingers of doom: a stuffed animal with its eyes sewn shut, a nursery rhyme book with all the words blacked out, except for "too late, too late." Whispers started to snake their way through the halls of Penn Manor High. Rumors that they were cursed, that they had been marked for something terrible. In a town where folklore was often traded like currency, the stories began to take on lives of their own. Each rumor seemed to feed into the sense of impending doom, giving it weight, making it real. People recounted older tales that their grandparents had once muttered about legends of vengeful spirits in haunting grounds near the little Susquehanna. It wasn't long before some began connecting the dots, tracing the events back to that fateful night over a year ago, when a young boy went missing. But it was too late for repentance. Too late for prayers to wash away the indelible marks on their consciences. The second Friday, the 13th since the boy's disappearance, was fast approaching, and this time, the day was greeted not with casual dismissals or light-hearted superstitions, but with a collective sense of dread. The group of teenagers, now bound not by friendship but by the shared weight of their dark secret, decided to confront the matter head-on. They returned to the place where it all began, the woods by the little Susquehanna River. No bonfire this time, no alcohol-fueled revelry. They were there to face whatever was haunting them, to put an end to the torment. As they stood in a circle, each person could feel the icy fingers of the past clawing at their back. The wind seemed to carry whispered accusations, the trees appeared to close in around them, and the darkness itself felt oppressive, as though trying to smother them. Then, she appeared. A silhouette in the waning moonlight, hazy, almost floating as she moved closer. She carried something in her hand, a rusty, old-fashioned lantern that cast an eerie glow on her features. She was almost within reach now, close enough for them to see the mixture of sorrow and rage that had carved itself onto her face. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke, her voice quivering with an emotion too complex to name. "Do you remember him?" She held up a picture, the one from her locket illuminated by the lantern's glow. The face of a young boy, forever frozen in a moment of innocent joy, stared back at them. The question lingered, echoing off the trees, mingling with the night air. The young people looked at each other, eyes wide, mouths agape, but no words came. Finally, one of them broke the silence. "We didn't mean to." But she cut him off. "Intentions are the comfort of fools and the damned," she hissed. "You all took something from me, and now, I will take something from you." The lantern flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. When it came back on, she was gone. But something had changed. An invisible line had been crossed. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, charged with the promise of unspeakable acts to come. In the days that followed, life in Millersville unraveled in ways that defied explanation. Accidents occurred with unsettling frequency, people reported visions and waking nightmares, doors were found inexplicably open, lights turned on. Fear had sunk its claws deep into the heart of the community. At the center of it all was the woman. Her plan had taken root, and the soil was fertile. Now, it was just a matter of time before she harvested the dark fruit it bore. Yet, even she could not predict the full scope of what she had set in motion. For the wheel had turned, and it would grind down everything in its path, guilty and innocent alike. And so, Millersville stood on the precipice, staring into an abyss of its own making, entirely unaware of how deep it went, or what horrors lay at the bottom. All they knew was that they were falling, and the darkness was rushing up to meet them. Perhaps the most terrifying part was the knowledge that this was just the beginning, a prologue to a story that had yet to reveal its most monstrous chapters. Because in those dark woods, on the banks of the Little Susquehanna, a lingering spirit had found its voice, its purpose, and its terrible, vengeful power. There would be no turning back. The storm had arrived, and it would show no mercy. As autumn leaves blanketed Millersville, creating a mosaic of red, orange, and brown that signaled the approaching winter, people had already begun locking their doors earlier, watching their children more closely, and avoiding eye contact with neighbors they'd known for years. It was as though the town itself were holding its breath, bracing for an impact that everyone felt but nobody could articulate. The community's sense of unity had been replaced by a veil of suspicion and fear. Nobody felt safe, especially when the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into an unsettling darkness. Inside the once close-knit group of teenagers, fractures were growing. They had dispersed in different directions after the harrowing night in the woods. Some coped through denial, trying to lose themselves in the mundanity of schoolwork and social obligations. Others spiraled, their eyes bloodshot, their minds a labyrinth of paranoia and guilt. And then there were those who searched for explanations in the esoteric, poring over old town records, newspaper clippings, and even delving into dark corners of the occult, trying to find something, anything that could give them a shred of understanding. Parents grew concerned, observing the sullen faces and troubled behaviors of not just these teens, but their friends and acquaintances as well. The school guidance counselor found his appointment book filled with names, yet sessions rarely yielded more than awkward silences and thinly veiled anxiety. Teachers noted the lack of focus, the jumpiness that seemed to grip students at random moments. Whispers among the faculty pointed to drugs, but deep down, they knew it was something far more insidious. As for the woman, she found that the soil of dread she had so carefully tilled was bearing grotesque fruit. She continued her nocturnal visits, no longer just a sentinel but an active agent of chaos. Electrical outages began to plague certain houses, cars inexplicably failed to start, cherished family heirlooms were found missing or destroyed. Yet, she left no evidence, no tangible trace of her interventions, just a lingering feeling of violation, a sense that the walls between the home and the horrors outside were thinning. Millersville's small police department found itself inundated with calls, stretching their limited resources. The town had seen its share of mischief and minor delinquencies, but this felt different. The police chief, a stern man who had served for decades, sensed that they were dealing with a new kind of malevolence, one that defied logic or reason. He increased patrols, particularly around the wooded areas bordering the Little Susquehanna River, but each morning's debrief only brought more questions, more dead ends, and an ever-growing sense of helplessness. The day before the next Friday the 13th, a strange occurrence seized the town's attention. The church at the center of Millersville, a historical landmark with a proud, tall steeple, had its large wooden doors defaced. Carved deeply into the ancient oak were symbols that no one could identify, but everyone could feel, a malevolent intent, an announcement that sanctity had been violated. And beneath the markings, almost as an afterthought, were the words, "Too late." This latest act seemed to be a tipping point. Townsfolk gathered in hastily arranged community meetings, theories were shared, and accusations were flung. Yet, for all the talk, they were no closer to answers, and the clock ticked inexorably toward the date that loomed large in everyone's minds. Preparations were made, people stocked up on non-perishables, flashlights, and yes, even weapons. No one spoke it out loud, but the message was clear: Millersville was under siege, and everyone was on their own when darkness fell. When the fated day arrived, the atmosphere was thick with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Schools let out early, businesses shuttered their windows, and by evening, the streets were empty. Families huddled together in their homes, some praying for the first time in years, others simply sitting in silence, staring at walls as though expecting them to crumble. And as the clock neared midnight, each tick amplifying the collective heartbeat of a community gripped by an unnamed dread, it became clear that this Friday the 13th would not pass quietly into the annals of Millersville's history. Something was coming, carried on the wind that howled through the skeletal trees, reflected in the turbulent waters of the Little Susquehanna River. The woman knew it, the teens who had set this in motion knew it, the town knew it. And when the first scream shattered the stillness of the night, echoing through the empty streets and into the darkened homes, everyone understood that the descent into darkness had only just begun. Millersville would never be the same again. For in the labyrinthine corridors of human fear, a door had been opened. What lay beyond was not just the reckoning for a crime long buried, but a cosmic horror that had found fertile ground in the frailties of human emotion and the vulnerabilities of community. And so, as the clock struck midnight, sealing the fate of a once peaceful town, the woman allowed herself a grim smile. For she knew that the night was still young, and there were many chapters yet to be written in this macabre tale. The Little Susquehanna would bear silent witness to it all, its waters growing darker with each passing moment, as if absorbing the very soul of Millersville into its depths. Perhaps some stories are not meant for tidy endings or moral lessons. Perhaps some chasms are too deep to be filled, some wounds too raw to heal. And as Millersville would soon learn, some horrors are too immense to be contained, even by the boundaries of a town, or the pages of a story. The storm had not just arrived, it had settled in, making a home in the fear-soaked earth, ready to unleash the kind of terror that defies description, understanding, or escape. In the woods, something stirred. A shapeless darkness, older and more insidious than any human malice, took form. The woman had been its catalyst, the townspeople its fuel, and now, it was ready to be born. The birth cries of this abomination would be the screams of an entire town, its lullaby the haunting refrain of unanswered questions and irrevocable acts. For Millersville, and for all who tread its cursed ground, the nightmare was only beginning. And in the ceaseless dark ahead, only one thing was certain: there would be no waking up. A week had passed since that wretched Friday the 13th, but the terrors of that night were far from forgotten. Millersville had experienced another layer of strangeness, manifesting not just in chilling physical events, but in a mental fog that seemed to envelop its inhabitants. Sleep was fractured by nightmares that defied description, full of shadowy figures and landscapes so surreal they could only be born from the darkest recesses of the human psyche. Helen Thompson, a middle-aged librarian, found herself diving deep into town records, seeking some historical precedent for these disturbing occurrences. She stumbled upon a curious document dated back to the late 19th century, a report of a series of disappearances near the Little Susquehanna River. They were written off as accidents, but the circumstances described bore an unsettling resemblance to recent events. At Millersville University, a group of psychology students, led by their curious and somewhat unorthodox professor Dr. Emily Lang, began an independent study of the collective behavior of the town. Their interviews and observations yielded disturbing patterns. Several people mentioned the feeling of being watched even in the sanctuary of their homes, and many recounted the same inexplicable nightmares. Meanwhile, the group of teenagers who had been present on that first night found themselves inextricably bound by their shared secret and growing dread. In a desperate bid to rid themselves of their guilt and fear, they agreed to meet up at the riverbank where it all started. They lit a bonfire, the flames flickering ominously as though trying to ward off an encroaching darkness. And then, each wrote down their most shameful secret, something that tied them to the terrifying events, and threw it into the fire as a form of catharsis, perhaps even atonement. Yet, as the scraps of paper turned to ash, they all felt it, the very air around them thickening, as if whatever they were trying to banish had instead been summoned. Eyes met, each teenager reflecting the horror they saw in one another. The woods around them seemed to close in, the trees like sentinels, the river's water unusually still, as if holding its breath. Elsewhere, the woman continued her clandestine activities, but with a newfound urgency. She had sensed the shift, the escalation of a horror she herself didn't fully comprehend. Delving into rituals and practices that she unearthed from dusty, forgotten tomes, she realized that her actions had caught the attention of something much older and far more malevolent than her own tortured spirit. Despite the enormity of her actions and their consequences, she found herself but a pawn in a cosmic game that spanned beyond time and reality. And as she looked into the mirror, she could swear her reflection grinned back at her, an omen of darker things awaiting. Another figure began to emerge in town, a drifter who went by the name of Jack. On the surface, he appeared to be just another transient, albeit one with an unnerving, piercing gaze and a knack for appearing whenever disaster struck. But Jack was no ordinary wanderer. He was a seeker of secrets, a hunter of dark truths. Millersville had caught his attention, and whatever was happening here, he surmised, was part of a larger tapestry of cosmic horror that had its tendrils in multiple dimensions. Jack knew that every ritual, every act of violence or fear, fed the malevolent entity that was slowly awakening. And so, he watched, his notebook filling up with observations and hypotheses, aware that he was racing against time. The entity was almost awake, and when it fully arose, not just Millersville, but the world itself, could be plunged into an eternal darkness. As winter approached, Millersville found itself cut off from the outside world in more ways than one. A snowstorm of unprecedented severity engulfed the region, making travel impossible. Phone lines went down, the internet flickered out, and even satellite signals grew sporadic. The town was isolated, as if the impending horror sought to keep its feast undisturbed. But even in isolation, there were sparks of humanity that refused to be extinguished. Families drew closer, community bonds were forged in the crucible of shared dread, and even among the tormented teens, love and friendship flourished like defiant flames in the all-encompassing dark. Yet, the entity fed on these bonds, twisting them into something perverse, corrupting love into obsession, friendship into betrayal. The stage was set for a reckoning. Each individual, each story, like threads in a tapestry, wove into a pattern that only now began to reveal itself. The woman, the teenagers, Helen, Dr. Lang, and even the enigmatic Jack all found themselves on a collision course with a destiny that promised not answers, but only deeper, more unfathomable questions. And in the frigid air of an approaching night, beneath a moon that seemed to leer rather than glow, something in the very fabric of Millersville quivered. It was as if the town itself sensed that the walls between worlds were thinning, that the darkness was reaching out its tendrils to claim not just the guilty, but the innocent as well. And somewhere in the depths of the little Susquehanna, something stirred once more, a ripple disturbing its icy surface, a harbinger of the terror that was no longer just knocking at the door, but had stepped across the threshold. Millersville braced itself, unaware that some lines, once crossed, redraw the map of reality itself, plunging even the bravest souls into a realm where not just nightmares, but their darker, nameless cousins, dwell. As the first snowflakes of the impending storm began to fall, Millersville residents went into a flurry of activity, boarding up their homes and stocking up on essentials. But what they didn't know was that no amount of preparation could fortify them against the approaching darkness. At the Millersville Police Department, Sheriff Tom Davis found himself sorting through a mountain of incident reports: stray pets, missing persons, and unsettling instances of vandalism involving occult symbols. Every fiber of his being sensed that these were not isolated occurrences but signs of a brewing malevolent storm. In a dingy basement, the woman, who had grown increasingly reclusive, laid out a series of old photographs, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn symbols in a complex pattern. She then took a dagger, its hilt adorned with intricate carvings, and began a chant that seemed to come from another era, another world. As she finished, the room darkened momentarily as if acknowledging her intent, and then returned to its usual dreary lighting. But something had changed. The air was now tinged with a palpable sense of dread. At the local diner, Jack sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee as he glanced through his notebook filled with cryptic observations and crisscrossing timelines. He had reached a grim conclusion: the terror descending upon Millersville was not a singular event but a cyclic occurrence. Every action, every decision, was a cog in a horrific machine destined to churn again and again until it achieved its dreadful purpose. Meanwhile, the group of teenagers, now bound by more than just guilt, found themselves the focus of escalating violence. Their homes were vandalized with ominous messages written in what appeared to be blood. Pets went missing, only to be found later in horrifying states. It seemed as if the sins of that night were coming back to haunt them in increasingly gruesome forms. Finally, on a night when the snowfall reached blizzard-like conditions, the darkness claimed its first victim. Mike, one of the teenagers from the river incident, was found dead in his home, his body contorted in an unnatural pose, eyes wide open in eternal terror. Authorities attributed it to a freak accident caused by a power outage, but those who saw the scene knew better. This was no accident, it was a message. Panic spread through Millersville like wildfire. The townspeople barricaded themselves in their homes as if walls and locks could keep out the malevolence that had enveloped their lives. The tension reached a breaking point at a town meeting, where accusations flew, alliances crumbled, and a fight broke out, leaving several people injured. It was evident that the town was tearing itself apart from the inside, playing right into the hands of the invisible puppeteer pulling the strings. Dr. Emily Lang, who had continued her investigation in spite of the growing danger, connected the dots between the psychological anomalies she had observed and the physical manifestations of horror in the town. She theorized that the events were not just the acts of a sadistic killer but were influenced by a hive mind of dread, a collective nightmare taking physical form. As the storm outside intensified, the lines between reality and nightmare blurred even further. Residents reported seeing shadowy figures lurking at the edges of their vision, only to vanish when confronted. Inanimate objects seemed to move on their own, as if possessed. Even the walls seemed to whisper in indecipherable languages, driving some to the brink of madness. Jack, now sure that the climax of this grim saga was at hand, took it upon himself to confront the dark force directly. Armed with knowledge gleaned from obscure texts and his own investigations, he ventured into the woods, towards the malevolent heart of it all, the little Susquehanna River. Arriving at the snow-covered riverbank, he set up an intricate pattern of salt and talismans, an attempt to contain whatever was emerging from the river's depths. But as he chanted the incantations, he realized something was terribly wrong. The air grew colder, and the snowflakes turned into ash, falling from a sky that seemed to darken by the second. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the icy waters, grotesque and yet strangely familiar. It was a distorted reflection of human suffering, eyes devoid of soul, and hands that seemed more like claws, ready to rend flesh from bone. Jack found himself paralyzed, not just by fear but by a sense of overwhelming despair. All his knowledge, all his preparations, had led him to this moment of utter helplessness. But before the figure could reach him, another presence intervened. The woman, now fully embraced by her dark path, appeared on the scene. She spoke words that seemed neither human nor entirely monstrous, and the figure hesitated, as if recognizing her authority. With a final incantation, she turned towards Jack and whispered, "Run." Back in town, the community felt a temporary reprieve, as if the noose had been loosened just a fraction. Families huddled together, still fearful but grateful for the momentary respite. Yet, in the pit of their stomachs, they knew that the nightmare was far from over. The woman returned to her sanctuary, her face a mask of cold resolve and burgeoning madness. Beside her, the figure from the river stood, obedient but restless, a harbinger of the cataclysm yet to unfold. Together, they would tear apart not just Millersville but the very fabric of reality, allowing the chaos of an unfathomable abyss to consume all. And so, as the first rays of a deceptive sun broke over Millersville, the malevolent tapestry continued to weave itself, each thread a tragedy, each pattern a prelude to an unspeakable climax. The dark multiverse of Millersville continued to unfold, a cosmic horror story with chapters yet to be written and victims yet to be claimed. The haunting chant, distorted as if whispered through layers of time and torment, reverberated through the air, clinging to the walls and the souls of Millersville's residents. It echoed from the dense woods surrounding the little Susquehanna River to the furthest corners of the town, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who heard it. Sheriff Tom Davis, already drowning in a sea of unanswered questions and fears he couldn't articulate, felt his heart skip a beat upon hearing the chant. The room at the police station grew colder, and he found his eyes darting involuntarily to the shadows, half expecting to see them coalesce into something sinister. On the outskirts of town, the woman looked up from her incantations, a smile spreading across her face like a crack in a porcelain doll. She sensed that another threshold had been crossed. The chant was a signal, a resonance in the cosmic symphony she was orchestrating. The figure beside her seemed to grow more substantial, as if the chant had fed its insubstantial form. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit room stacked with ancient tomes and scribbled notes, Jack felt his skin crawl. He knew the significance of the chant. It was a herald, an announcement of a reality so terrifying that the mind recoiled to ponder it. His research had indicated that certain sounds, certain frequencies, could serve as conduits for unimaginable forces. The chant was one such key, and now it seemed that door had been unlocked. The collective psyche of Millersville reached a breaking point. Isolated incidents of violence erupted, individuals driven to madness by a force they couldn't comprehend. Families, once the bedrock of this small community, became fractious and disjointed. Brothers turned on sisters, parents on children, as if the most primal bonds of humanity had been severed by an invisible blade. In a desperate attempt to bring some semblance of normality, Dr. Emily Lang organized a community gathering at the local church, hoping that faith might offer solace where logic had failed. Yet, as she stepped up to the makeshift podium, she felt a tremor of dread. Her eyes met those of the woman, who had slipped into the congregation unnoticed, her gaze both empty and insatiable. Before Dr. Lang could speak, the lights flickered, and the walls of the church trembled as if shaken by some great force. In that moment, the chant echoed once again, louder this time, reverberating through the very stones of the church. Ki ki ki, ma ma ma. Pandemonium broke out, people screamed and trampled over each other in a mad rush to escape, only to find the doors inexplicably locked. Dr. Lang, terror mingling with the realization of the futility of her efforts, felt a sudden pull from behind. She turned to see the woman standing there, eyes filled with an abyss of darkness, one hand extended towards her. The other held a dagger, its blade shimmering with an otherworldly glow. At that very instant, the figure materialized in the center of the chaos, its form more horrendous than ever. It was as if the fabric of reality had torn, allowing this monstrosity to step through. It moved with a swift, predatory grace, each movement accompanied by the sound of the chant, now a constant drone filling the space. Dr. Lang felt the woman's grip tighten around her wrist, pulling her closer to the monstrous figure. It was then that she understood the woman and the figure were bound by a dark symbiosis, one feeding off the horror and despair of the other. The dagger rose high, catching a glint of the dying lights. And then, from the back of the room, a voice pierced through the chaos. "Stop!" It was Jack. He held an object in his hand, a talisman pulsing with an ethereal light, its intricacies etched with ancient runes. He spoke a phrase, incomprehensible and yet filled with undeniable power. For a brief moment, the figure wavered, as if struggling against unseen chains. Taking advantage of the pause, Dr. Lang wrestled free from the woman's grasp, rushing towards Jack. The crowd, momentarily jarred from their hysteria, managed to break down the doors and escape, their minds scarred but their lives intact. Jack, Dr. Lang, and the woman locked eyes, a triad of conflicting wills. Finally, the woman receded, merging into the shadows as if she were a part of them, her monstrous companion dematerializing in a wisp of dark smoke. For now, at least, the immediate horror was averted. But each knew that this was not an end, but a pause, a brief respite in a continuum of dread. The chant had awakened something ancient and malevolent, and though it had been silenced for the moment, its echoes would reverberate through Millersville for generations to come. The townspeople returned to their homes, the feeling of impending doom weighing heavily on them. They locked their doors, but not their secrets or their guilt, knowing that the latter were not so easily contained. And somewhere in the labyrinthine shadows of reality, the chant continued, a haunting refrain in the ever-expanding multiverse of horror that was Millersville, Pennsylvania. The aftermath of that nightmarish gathering at the church settled over Millersville like a heavy fog, thickening the air with tension and whispered theories. Rumors spread like wildfire, stories of spectral figures and devilish chants were shared in hushed tones at the local diners and gas stations. It was as if the entire town was waiting for something, another signal, another slip in the fabric of their reality. And, so it seemed, they wouldn't have to wait for long. Sheriff Tom Davis found himself inundated with reports of inexplicable occurrences. Livestock mutilated in gruesome patterns, strange markings appearing on trees near the Little Susquehanna River, and more alarmingly, missing persons, each case echoing the next, forming a spine-chilling tapestry of horror. Adding to this chaos were the recurring dreams reported by several residents, dreams of drowning, the sensation of water filling their lungs, the murky depths of the river pulling them deeper. Dreams so vivid they seemed less like dreams and more like memories or warnings. Among those grappling with the after effects was Dr. Emily Lang, her research at Millersville University now taking a darker turn as she delved into arcane lore and unorthodox scientific theories. Her office was littered with old maps of the area, occult texts, and news articles detailing the town's history. She was drawn back repeatedly to the 1978 incident at the Little Susquehanna River, a tragedy that had left a scar on the community, even though most had forgotten or deliberately overlooked it. Jack, the enigmatic researcher who had intervened at the church, found himself a reluctant ally to Dr. Lang. The two spent hours poring over old documents, connecting seemingly disparate events, all leading back to the river. "It's like the epicenter of everything that's happening," Emily said one evening, her voice tinged with exhaustion and dread. "But why? And what exactly is waiting for us there? Unbeknownst to them, another sequence of events was unfolding parallel to their investigation, each moment orchestrated by the mysterious woman. She would often retreat into the heart of the woods, near the shore of the Little Susquehanna, performing rites known only to her and her malevolent companion. It was as if they were preparing for some final crescendo in this symphony of dread. A new figure emerged. The tension in Millersville was palpable, almost as if the very air had thickened. Sheriff Tom Davis, now worn down by the countless odd occurrences and mysterious reports, received another curious visitor one foggy evening. A stranger, disheveled yet oddly charismatic, strolled into the police station. He didn't give a name but claimed to be an out-of-towner who had lost his way. The sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about this man, like a character from a half-forgotten dream. The stranger was well-spoken but elusive, his inquiries about the town seeming both casual and calculated. He asked about the local history, recent events, and the mood among the populace. As he left the station, he exchanged a lingering glance with Sheriff Davis, and for a moment, the sheriff felt as if this stranger could see right through him. Meanwhile, Dr. Emily Lang and Jack were reaching a turning point in their investigations. As they sifted through layers of mystery, they stumbled upon an ominous pattern in the occurrences, a cycle, tied to the lunar calendar, with each new moon corresponding to a surge in unexplainable events and sightings around the Little Susquehanna River. The stranger began appearing in various locales around Millersville, observing the landscape with an analytical eye. He visited the Little Susquehanna River during the dead of night, took detailed notes, and seemed particularly interested in the very trees that had those strange markings. He avoided interaction but was invariably spotted by one or two residents, including a bar owner named Cindy, who noted that the man ordered the same drink every night, a scotch on the rocks, and always sat facing the door, as if expecting someone, or something. As the new moon approached, another character re-emerged, the mysterious woman. Her rituals intensified, and she could be seen skirting the woods, often accompanied by her monstrous companion. The energies they had been harnessing were almost ripe, culminating in a palpable aura of impending dread that seemed to hang over the town. But she was not alone. The stranger was there too, watching from a distance, shrouded by the night. He seemed impervious to the malevolent atmosphere, and even the creature paused, sensing his presence though failing to pinpoint his location. There was something about this stranger, his calculated movements, his analytical eye, and the concealed .44 Magnum that glinted briefly under the moonlight. And those eyes, piercing through the darkness, glowing faintly like the eyes of a nocturnal predator. On the eve of the new moon, another gathering was called, this time at the Millersville Community Center. Dr. Emily Lang and Jack felt it was crucial to share their findings, to make the residents aware of the pattern they had discovered. As the meeting unfolded, a latecomer slipped quietly into the room. It was the stranger, and this time, Sheriff Tom Davis knew exactly where he had seen those familiar eyes. They had peered back at him from numerous case files and newspaper clippings over the years. And so, for the first time, their paths converged. Dr. Lang, Jack, the sheriff, and the stranger whose real name would soon be revealed, setting the stage for an inevitable confrontation. The elements were aligning, the characters were in place, and as Millersville held its collective breath, it was clear that the coming new moon would bring with it a reckoning of horrifying proportions. As the community meeting at Millersville's community center progressed, an air of restless anticipation settled over the room. Dr. Emily Lang's revelations were met with a mixture of skepticism and fear. Jack, pacing nervously behind her, could feel the collective mood tipping toward panic. But before another word could be said, Sheriff Tom Davis stood up, interrupting the silence. "We have a situation," he declared, his eyes scanning the crowd before finally landing on the stranger seated in the back. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. Just then, an urgent dispatch call crackled through the sheriff's radio, breaking the tense silence. Multiple reports of disturbances near the Little Susquehanna River. Request immediate assistance. The room erupted into hushed conversations and concerned murmurs. Sheriff Davis grabbed his coat and headed for the door, beckoning for Dr. Lang and Jack to follow. The stranger also rose from his seat and blended into the chaos, trailing behind them as they left. The journey to the river was fraught with a sense of urgency and dread. Sheriff Davis drove, his grip tightening around the wheel with every passing second. Dr. Lang stared out of the window, her mind racing through possibilities and theories. Jack, too, seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant yet vigilant. Unbeknownst to them, the stranger had followed in his own nondescript car, maintaining a safe distance. They arrived at the riverbank, the darkness overwhelming, broken only by the beams from their flashlights. What met their eyes defied explanation. The trees with the strange markings were now uprooted, creating a grotesque semicircle near the water's edge. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, an almost electric hum that vibrated through the ground beneath them. As Dr. Lang stepped forward to examine one of the uprooted trees, her flashlight caught a glint of something metallic half buried in the ground, a bullet casing. .44 Magnum. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, puzzled. Before she could voice her thoughts, a bone-chilling growl echoed from the dark woods beyond the river. They all turned toward the sound, their hearts pounding. The stranger, standing just at the periphery of their flashlight beams, felt a cold smile spread across his face. For the first time, his eyes glinted visibly in the darkness, a pair of glowing orbs, almost feral, illuminating his rugged features. He unholstered his .44 Magnum and aimed it toward the eerie darkness beyond the river, right where the growl had originated. Time to pull back the curtain, he whispered to himself, as a feeling of grim satisfaction washed over him. Just then, an unholy shriek ripped through the night air, so piercing it seemed as if the very atmosphere had been torn asunder. Something was emerging from the darkness, something both human and monstrously inhuman, hell-bent on consummating the evil that had been festering in the town of Millersville for far too long. And as the entities on both sides readied themselves, a name resounded in the stranger's mind, a name that would soon be revealed, a name that would tip the balance of this intricate dance between light and dark. The name was Johnny Vanjuk. And this twisted tale of terror had just found its catalyst for the impending climax that would either liberate Millersville or plunge it into an eternal nightmare. The haunting key, ma resonated through the misty air, a symphonic chorus of impending doom that seemed to emanate from every corner of the woods surrounding the Little Susquehanna River. The date's cruel irony dawned upon Dr. Lang and Sheriff Davis. It was Friday the 13th. But the date had an even more sinister implication. It was also a birthday. A day of birth that had spiraled into an unspeakable tragedy years before, leaving behind an insidious legacy of horror that had woven itself into the very fabric of Millersville. As the dark forms began to coalesce in the inky shadows, the stranger, now internally acknowledged as Johnny Vanjuk, felt an electric thrill of dark excitement. His eyes shone like phosphorescent orbs as he readied his .44 Magnum. "Looks like I've crashed the birthday party," he muttered. Suddenly, a monstrous figure lunged from the darkness, charging with inhuman speed and ferocity. Dr. Lang screamed, instinctively stepping back. Sheriff Davis raised his shotgun, but before he could pull the trigger, a deafening blast reverberated through the night. Johnny Vanjuk's .44 Magnum roared, its flash briefly illuminating the grotesque features of the entity. It let out an agonized screech, temporarily thwarted, and retreated back into the shadows. The momentary respite allowed them to regroup. Dr. Lang, her hands trembling, looked at Johnny. "Who are you?" she stammered. "I'm the one who's going to end this," Johnny replied, reloading his Magnum. His presence was like an enigmatic force, both unsettling and oddly reassuring. His connection to Millersville was a mystery yet to unravel, but for now, his objectives aligned with theirs to confront and terminate the malevolent beings haunting their town. Sheriff Davis, still stunned, finally spoke. "Do you know what we're dealing with?" Johnny looked towards the direction from where the creature had emerged. "Evil doesn't change, Sheriff. It just wears different faces. Today, it's wearing one that this town should have dealt with a long time ago." Just then, a sorrowful wail filled the air. It was mournful yet brimming with malevolent intent. It was a mother's lament, a requiem for a twisted love that defied the natural order. The mysterious woman was closer than they'd ever sensed her before. And with her was the monstrosity, now more emboldened, perhaps aware that its day of reckoning had come. As the chilling wail resonated through the woods, a collective realization washed over them. The woman and her abominable companion were manifestations of a story that had mutated into a terrible reality, a localized legend bred from a mother's grief and an unspeakable tragedy that had occurred years ago. Only now, the woman was no mere grieving mother, and her companion was no innocent victim. They had become avatars of pure malevolence, out to wreak havoc and sow chaos. "Tonight, it ends," Johnny Vanjik proclaimed, his voice laced with steely resolve. As they advanced toward the epicenter of the haunting sounds, each armed and each carrying their own burden of dread, one thing was certain: the events of this unholy Friday the 13th would forever be etched into the annals of Millersville's history, either as a grim tragedy or as a night when darkness was vanquished. But whatever the outcome, Johnny Vanjik knew that this macabre dance was far from over. For darkness has a way of mutating, of finding new vessels, and as long as there were shadows cast upon the world, there would always be malevolent forces lurking within them. And so, the trigger was cocked, the stage was set, and in a town caught between past sins and an uncertain future, the first act of a horrifying climax was about to unfold. As the group drew closer to the source of the chilling wails, Johnny Vanjik felt an unsettling realization wash over him. This entity, this monstrous manifestation of sorrow and rage, was not something that could be simply vanquished with a bullet. This was an abomination that defied the laws of nature and mortality. "Be prepared. Conventional means won't stop it," Johnny warned, looking directly at Sheriff Davis and Dr. Lang. His voice was tinged with an almost respectful recognition of the adversary's indomitable nature. A cacophony of unsettling noises now filled the night air, a mixture of the eerie ki, ma chant, anguished wails, and rustling leaves, as if the very forest was a living entity participating in this theater of horror. Suddenly, the grotesque figure emerged again, this time with a ferocious energy that suggested an otherworldly resilience. Sheriff Davis fired his shotgun, hitting the creature square in the chest. It staggered back but did not fall, its agonized screech more of outrage than of pain. Johnny Vanjik aimed his .44 Magnum and fired. The creature recoiled, momentarily stunned, but still very much alive, or whatever its unholy state could be called. As it recovered, its eyes locked onto Johnny's, and for a fleeting moment, there was a recognition, a mirroring of darkness that neither could fully comprehend. "Can't kill what's not living," Johnny muttered, more to himself than anyone else, understanding now that the entity before them was not bound by the limitations of flesh and blood. It was as if it was fueled by the dark emotions that had given birth to it: the grief, the hatred, the desire for revenge, and as such, it was virtually indestructible. Dr. Lang, eyes wide, grabbed Johnny's arm. "Then what do we do? How do you stop something that can't be killed?" The air grew thick with a foul, wet smell like decayed foliage and stagnant water. The chanting grew louder, reverberating off the trees, the sky, the very atoms in the air. And then, she emerged, the spectral woman, her visage twisted in a permanent mask of sorrow and malevolence. Her presence seemed to invigorate the creature, empowering it with renewed fervor. "We have to separate them," Johnny declared, a plan quickly forming in his mind. Their power comes from their unholy union. One fuels the other. We break the link, we break their strength. But how does one sever a connection rooted in something as intangible yet powerful as a mother's love twisted into malevolence? It was a perilous gambit, but it was the only plan they had. As the nightmarish duo advanced on them, their malevolent energies almost palpable, Johnny, Sheriff Davis, and Dr. Lang steeled themselves for a confrontation that would determine not just their fates, but the soul of Millersville itself. This was at the climax of a cursed tale years in the making, about to unfold on the banks of the little Susquehanna River, in a town gripped by a legacy of horror. Whether this twisted maternal bond could be severed, and at what cost, remained the dreadful unknown. But Johnny Vanjik knew one thing for certain: the darkness ahead was unlike any he had faced before, and as the line between the living and the dead blurred in the most horrific of ways, they were about to venture into uncharted territory, where conventional rules did not apply. Sheriff Davis stared at Johnny, incredulous, his voice tinged with desperation and disbelief. "And how do you even know all this, Vanjik?" Johnny looked up, his eyes glowing like orbs in the dark, taking on an almost otherworldly hue. "Simple. I hunt these things for a living in your time and many others." "What?" both Dr. Lang and Sheriff Davis exclaimed in unison, their voices pitching high in a cocktail of fear and astonishment. Before any more could be said, a deafening screech filled the air. The monstrous figure Jason moved with terrifying speed, lunging toward them with an inexplicable blend of rage and intent. The sudden attack caught them off guard, scattering them in different directions. Sheriff Davis found himself thrown against a tree, disoriented but still gripping his shotgun. Dr. Lang stumbled and tripped over the forest underbrush, her flashlight spinning away into the darkness. Johnny Vanjik managed to roll away, his .44 Magnum knocked out of his hand in the melee. They were separated just as Jason and the spectral woman had intended. Isolation was their advantage, unity the group's only strength, and now that was gone. Sheriff Davis shook his head to clear his thoughts and looked around. His eyes met Johnny's for a brief moment, and in that split second, a silent understanding passed between them. Time was of the essence, they had to act now. Sheriff Davis took off in one direction, intent on finding Dr. Lang and regrouping. Johnny, his eyes still glowing, went in search of his Magnum. Each step they took was heavy with dread, for they knew that in their isolated states they were most vulnerable to the relentless entities hunting them. Deep in the woods, Dr. Lang heard footsteps approaching. Her heart pounded as she braced herself for the worst. The flashlight beam then flickered across her face. It was Sheriff Davis, visibly shaken but alive. "Are you all right?" he asked, extending his hand to help her up. "I am, but we need to find Johnny and end this," Dr. Lang said, her voice tinged with an urgency that resonated with the sheriff. Meanwhile, Johnny Vanjik had found his Magnum. As he picked it up, he sensed rather than heard the low growl that came from behind him. He turned around slowly, his finger poised on the trigger. There, lurking in the shadowy recesses of the forest, were the glowing eyes of Jason. And unlike the others, Johnny was not surprised. This was a confrontation he had been preparing for across time, across realms. Now it was here. But even as Johnny steadied his aim, he knew that the bullets would not be the end of this creature. They would only be the opening move in a terrifying endgame that had been years in the making. A clash of darkness against darkness, where the stakes were not just their lives, but the soul of an entire town. And so, with the spectral woman's mournful wail echoing through the woods as if in perverse encouragement, Johnny Vanjik and the monstrosity locked eyes one more time, each recognizing in the other a formidable adversary. With an almost palpable tension in the air, Johnny finally spoke, his voice steely and resolute. "Happy birthday, you son of a bitch. Let's end this." The atmosphere was electric, charged with an amalgam of dread, history, and twisted fate, as they prepared to engage in a battle whose outcome was as uncertain as it was inevitable. Johnny Vanjik's eyes remained locked onto the grotesque figure before him, the glow in both of their gazes almost pulsating in this tense standoff. With his .44 Magnum aimed and steady, Johnny pulled the trigger. A thunderous shot echoed through the forest, illuminating the clearing for a split second as the bullet found its mark. Jason staggered back but did not fall. A guttural growl emanated from his throat, a beastly sound tinged with malice and defiance. With an inhuman burst of speed, he lunged at Johnny, brandishing a crude yet devastatingly sharp weapon. Johnny sidestepped just in time, feeling the rush of air as the weapon missed him by mere inches. The fight was on, a deadly dance where the misstep of a moment could spell eternal darkness. Meanwhile, Sheriff Davis and Dr. Lang had followed the ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from the spectral woman Pamela. They found her standing next to a dilapidated shack, her visage even more malevolent in the sickly, unnatural light that surrounded her. "Sheriff, we have to do this now," Dr. Lang urged, pulling a vial from her pocket. It contained a mixture of salt and various herbs, a concoction meant to weaken or banish spirits. She uncorked it and started chanting an incantation, her voice almost drowned out by the spectral woman's unnerving wail. Sheriff Davis raised his shotgun, his eyes meeting Dr. Lang's as if seeking a silent affirmation. She nodded, and he pulled the trigger. At the same time, Dr. Lang hurled the vial at the spectral woman. The shot hit its target, disorienting her, while the vial shattered, enveloping her in a cloud of salt and herbs. A gut-wrenching scream filled the air as she seemed to waver and flicker, as if her connection to this realm had been weakened. Back at Johnny's location, the fight was reaching its zenith. Blow after blow, shot after shot, both Johnny and Jason seemed to draw from an endless well of stamina and rage. But Johnny could feel that Jason was different now, perhaps weakened by whatever Sheriff Davis and Dr. Lang were doing to Pamela. Seizing the opportunity, Johnny aimed his magnum one more time and shot, hitting Jason square in the chest. Jason let out an agonized screech but did not go down. Instead, he glared at Johnny, as if acknowledging his tenacity but also signaling that this fight was far from over. "Fine by me," Johnny growled, lowering his weapon but keeping his gaze locked onto his opponent. "Whenever you're ready to continue, I'll be here." The tension was palpable, a static charge in the air that promised more darkness, more conflict. For now, though, there was a lull, a momentary pause in this eternal struggle, as if the universe itself held its breath, waiting for the next horrifying chapter in this twisted tale. In that volatile clearing amidst the twisted trees of Millersville's dark woods, Johnny Vanjik felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: finality. This moment, this confrontation, had an air of conclusiveness that made his skin crawl. With a surge of adrenaline, Johnny lunged for the machete that Jason had dropped in their tussle. Gripping it tightly, he swung it at the monstrosity before him. The blade sliced through the air and found its mark, slashing across Jason's arm. A guttural growl emanated from the depths of the masked figure's throat, but Johnny was already in motion. He drew his .44 Magnum and fired several rounds. Each bullet hit with a force that would have dropped any mortal man, but Jason was no such thing. Just as Johnny prepared to fire another round, Jason's weapon, a gruesome, makeshift blade, came swinging through the air. It connected, sending a shock of pain through Johnny's arm and causing him to drop his magnum. Blood flowed down his arm, warm and slick, but Johnny's gaze remained locked onto Jason's mask. Time was running out, he knew what he had to do. With a snarl, Johnny lunged forward, grabbing the edges of Jason's mask and ripping it off with all his might. The face beneath was a grotesque caricature of humanity, twisted and malformed. Without a moment's hesitation, Johnny used his remaining strength to pummel Jason's face with the machete's hilt, each strike fueled by years of hunting. by the weight of lost souls and endless timelines. Finally, after blows that left Jason's eye sockets unrecognizable, Johnny took one last look at the monster he had vanquished. Then, mustering every ounce of strength left in his weary body, he grabbed Jason by the neck and threw both of them into the depths of the little Susquehanna River. They hit the water with a splash that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the universe, a sound that signaled both an end and an eternal silence. As they sank deeper into the dark waters, Johnny felt his consciousness slipping away, but he held on to Jason, making sure the monstrosity would not escape this watery tomb. Then, as darkness closed in around him, Johnny Vanjik felt a strange peace. For the first time, in this timeline or any other, he had found an end, a cessation to the relentless pursuit that had been his existence. With that final thought, Johnny Vanjik and the nightmare named Jason Voorhees disappeared into the murky depths, never to resurface. Above them, the little Susquehanna River continued its endless flow, as if washing away the stains of an incomprehensible evil and the echoes of a fight that defied the boundaries of time and reality. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pallor over the quiet town of Millersville, oblivious to the eternal struggle that had just reached its horrific conclusion. And so, the story came to an end, or perhaps, just another haunting pause, in a tale as old as fear itself. As dawn broke over the little Susquehanna River, the eerie stillness that had blanketed Millersville began to lift. Birds started to sing, their melodies filling the air, as if trying to cleanse the horrors that had unfolded on that fateful Friday the 13th. Sheriff Davis and Dr. Lang stood by the riverbank, their faces etched with the weight of what they'd experienced. Both had felt a chilling calm settle over the woods, as if the malevolent force that had lurked there had finally been extinguished. "People will talk, you know," Sheriff Davis said quietly. "They'll say it's some kind of legend or folk tale. But we know better, don't we?" Dr. Lang looked at the rising sun, her eyes filled with an indescribable mix of relief and sorrow. "Yes, we do. But legends have a way of coming back, Sheriff. We can't forget what happened here. We have to stay vigilant." As they walked away, the camera equipment that Johnny Vanjik had set up to document his hunt captured one last scene, the placid surface of the river, and the reflection of the morning sun, as if signaling both an end and a new beginning. Then the camera's battery died, leaving behind a lasting image of tranquility that belied the unspeakable events of the night before. The Friday the 13th curse that had gripped the town was broken, or so it seemed. And yet, deep within the waters of the little Susquehanna, where daylight couldn't reach, the dark secrets of that night would remain, hidden but not forgotten. Whether by some twist of fate or by the sheer indomitable will of those who had fought against it, the terror had ended for now. But as the townspeople of Millersville began to pick up the pieces, one question lingered in the air, a haunting reminder that some evils never truly die. When the calendar once again marks that ill-fated date, would the nightmare return? For now, at least, Friday the 13th was over. As the final echoes of "ki ki ki ma ma ma" reverberated through the still air, a shiver passed through those who heard it. Even as life in Millersville returned to its quiet routine, those haunting syllables served as a chilling reminder that some tales are never truly over. They become the stuff of legends, whispered around campfires and passed down through generations, their power to terrify undiminished by the passage of time. As kids went back to school, as leaves began to fall in the steady march toward another winter, residents found themselves glancing over their shoulders more often. Despite the tranquil facade, the memory of that horrific Friday the 13th clung to the town like a shadow. The surface of the little Susquehanna River remained undisturbed, its depths hiding secrets that perhaps should never be unearthed. And every now and then, when the moon was just a sliver in the night sky, you could almost hear it, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of water churning, as if something below was stirring, waiting for the right moment to rise again. But for now, those eerie sounds were drowned out by the clamor of everyday life, leaving only the whispered refrain of "ki ki ki ma ma ma" to keep the legend alive. The end. Or is it just another beginning in the terrifying lore of Millersville? Only time will tell. In a cinematic fade, the tranquil surface of the little Susquehanna River gives way to a group of callous teenagers, their laughter tinged with cruelty as they push a deformed young kid towards the water's edge. With a final shove, the kid splashes into the river, sputtering and gasping for air, arms flailing as he's pulled down by the current. At the same time, a few miles downriver, the battered body of Johnny Vanjik washes ashore. He coughs up water, eyes flickering open with the barest glint of life. With each painful inch, he crawls toward what he hopes is civilization, pausing only to glance back at the river, convinced he's put an end to the terror that haunts it. Back at the first location, the deformed child starts to go under, when suddenly he's lifted, almost hurled to the shore, but with a touch more gentleness. The group of teenagers freeze, their sadistic glee transforming into raw horror as they come face to face with a menacing figure, Jason Voorhees. Whatever malevolent force they had roused, it would not let history repeat itself. The next moments are a blur of unspeakable violence, of screams that pierce the night and get swallowed by the dense forest. When the carnage is over, not much is left of those teens. Their twisted, unrecognizable forms lie scattered near the water's edge. Jason then turns to the deformed child, who is watching in both terror and fascination. He lays down a machete in front of the young one, a symbol or perhaps a rite of passage. With a final, inscrutable glance, Jason turns and walks back into the depths of the river, disappearing into its murky darkness. The screen fades to black on the kid's bewildered face, left alone on the riverbank, but alive. In the distance, the faint echo of "ki ki ki ma ma ma" fills the air, a chilling lullaby that melds with the sound of the rushing river, leaving the viewers with a haunting realization: evil may be vanquished, heroes may rise and fall, but legends never truly die. The end.